Just going to start this video off with a spoiler warning. This will mostly cover Helltaker's level design aspects, but I'll be discussing the characters and dialogue a little bit as well. If you're interested in playing the game without knowing a great deal of what the levels or characters look like, the game is only a couple hours long. Check it out and then come back here. Ever since the release of Helltaker in 2020, I've both been impressed and fascinated by the game's puzzle design, style, and character. For all those uninitiated, Helltaker's pitch is that it is a short game about sharply dressed demon girls. Essentially, your main character wakes up one day and on a complete whim decides to travel to Hell to collect a harem of demon girls. Luckily, this game is much tamer than the synopsis would have you believe. The story is more of a comedic take on this plot than degenerate. This is a very charming game that doesn't take its story too seriously at all. It's all about giving players a balance between challenging puzzles and a fun cast of characters that you get to enjoy watching bounce off of each other. A big part of my admiration for this game's design comes from how tightly made this package is. It feels very consistently great, and it's a very well done example of scope in game design. Scope in game design terms is the measure of work that a project will take to complete. A project's scope is usually determined by the combination of planned features and development needs. For example, adding online multiplayer to any game will raise the scope drastically. Between getting multiplayer to work and balancing the content in multiplayer, adding online multiplayer to your game will inherently come with an added level of work. Now, one aspect of Helltaker that I adore is its scope. It goes quite far with a handful of mechanics and a cast of entertaining characters. I'm going to have a couple of topics to discuss per level. A fair amount of these topics will pertain to other levels. The levels I choose to highlight them will all, theoretically, be the best spot to cover them. Right at the start, Helltaker's first level is a well-constructed introduction to its base game mechanics. The first important part of note is how the player must interact with both the skeletons and blocks to get to the end of the level. This sets the precedent that these two types of obstacles aren't just interactable, but how you can interact with them. No matter how you go about it, you will destroy at least one skeleton against a wall to advance. Conversely, push blocks can't be destroyed. It was a good choice to introduce both of these mechanics in the same level, since they're so functionally similar. With how short this game is as well, boasting a condensed package of 10 levels, it doesn't hurt to introduce two mechanics at the same time to keep the pacing of the difficulty engaging. The level ends once you reach the demon girl that resides in it. Even if you manage to get past the skeletons and push blocks, the demon may make you play it all over again. Once you reach her, you're given a short sequence of dialogue, which results in you needing to make a choice between conversation paths. Choose the correct one, and you'll win the demon girl's heart over, advancing to the next level. Choose the incorrect one, and you'll die in a way that usually displays a bit of the demon's personality, before being brought back to the start of the level. With this part of the gameplay introduced, we can observe Helltaker's two main modes of engaging the player. The game is split between puzzles and dialogue to create an equal balance of intelligent level design and comedic storytelling. I really find this to be the perfect balance. Getting to the end of a level is rewarding both because you just overcame a puzzle, but also because you get more dialogue with one of Helltaker's endearing characters. What adds to the sense of discovery with these demon girls is how each one has such a distinct personality, sold straight away from their designs and short lines of dialogue. Without even showing you text describing these characters, it'd be fairly easy to distinguish their personalities just from the character art. Now, believe it or not, this aspect does add another angle to the level design. The flow between solving a puzzle and getting more dialogue sections has a big impact on engaging the player to continue discovering what the next demon has to say. Moving on to level 2, we still have some key mechanics left to cover. For starters, each level includes life advice. This mechanic was also in level 1, but I chose to cover it here because the life advice in that level pokes fun at how there's no life advice to give with no demon girls. Essentially, life advice doubles as both a fun bit of extra dialogue with the demons you've collected so far, and as a way to include some subtle and not so subtle hints about the puzzles. For example, this life advice discusses spikes and will points. Will points provide a bit of extra difficulty for each puzzle. There are quite a few puzzles in the game that would be a lot easier had it not been for the restriction of the player's moves. To tie in with that, spikes are introduced as an interesting hazard. While they subtract 2 will points per move instead of 1, the player will have to go over some of them to complete the level spikes are featured in. Again, it's very important that the player sees that they can go over the spikes. They should just want to go over the least amount possible. Had these not been here, I'm sure quite a few players would try to avoid spikes entirely out of fear of instant death. Next up we have level 3. This level introduces a very familiar sight with block pushing games. The main objective in all these games are for the player to go from point A to B. The reason you'll see a lot of key and lock puzzle mechanics in Sokoban games is because it adds a third point. Now, you'll have to go from point A to B to C. It easily extends the complexity of the level. This is yet another example of how quickly Helltaker will introduce new concepts to the player. This level is actually one of my favorites in the game for how perfectly its ideas are represented, and player psychology is exploited. On your first playthrough, your first instinct is likely to kick the skeleton, instead of going over the spikes to get the key. This is because kicking the skeleton results in it shattering like a piñata, and going over the spikes results in a screen shake, a cutting sound, and some bleeding. Van Ripper purposefully made the level so that it can only be defeated by going over these spikes in the beginning. Even though they have a double turn deduction penalty, it's actually just barely more turn efficient to go over these 4 spike tiles than to kick the skeleton down this hallway. The life advice even subtly hints at this aspect of the level by telling you not to mess around with it too much. And on your trip from the key to the door, you even get to kick the skeleton like how you were originally tricked to. So, you get some extra satisfaction not just for finishing the level, but also by being able to kick this bone piñata. My last point about this level is how great it is that so many of the wrong versions to complete it are just 1 away from the goal. It's this factor that makes will point such a worthwhile addition. The idea of the player being right there, but not close enough, is a really fun aspect to play around in these games. It prolongs the satisfaction of completing the level, and inherently makes it more difficult, but it also makes it feel like every level has a correct solution. Of course, it's also fun to see levels with multiple correct solutions, which we begin to see a few of, starting with level 4. It's genius how Van Ripper introduces us to a new mechanic and makes it optional in the very next level. In fact, to get the secret ending, you need to avoid using the key. I always appreciate when levels can be clever like this. This level has 2 drastically different ways to beat it. The first way plays off of the player's expectation to use the mechanic they just learned about. The second way involves clearing this path of bricks. Once I learned about this second method, it became the normal way for me to beat the level. This level also introduces secret items, which add some extra challenge and replayability to Helltaker. Considering Helltaker's short length, adding these secret items in levels 4, 5, and 6 add a bit of replay value once you've beaten the whole story. The methods of obtaining these secret items test the player's knowledge of block pushing mechanics. They may be asking a bit much from the player when they're presented as early as level 4, but luckily, they are optional. With how easy it is to replay levels in Helltaker, players can beat the level with the easier method before returning for more content should they please. Level 5 introduces spike tiles that will alternate their activeness every turn. This is a very bold mechanic to implement, as I can easily see some players being unsure if jumping onto the next tile in this situation is good or not. However, Helltaker is great at letting players explore different ways to interact with the level without much penalty at all, so this is easily forgiven. Plus, you can make the argument that players have already learned the worst spike tiles will do to them is subtract 2 will points instead of 1. Now the way level 5 introduces these mechanics is brilliant. This concept is not as intuitive as a key and door, so the way Van Ripper circumvented this was to put the player in this mini hallway at the start of the level. The restriction of player movement isn't done often. Here, the player's only choice is to go down. This simplicity is done so that the player can easily see that with each step, the tiles alternate. The player really starts making choices that can diverge here. This is a pretty clever way to introduce the player to a new mechanic, one that isn't super intuitive. He even utilizes the skeleton in a clever way, as it explodes when these spikes pop up. Van Ripper didn't have to include this, but I think the skeleton's inclusion just makes this part all the more bearable on repeat attempts. Like I said earlier, it's just fun to see this guy explode into a bunch of bones. I also really enjoy how even though this level is all about trying to time your movements on these spike tiles, there are some moments where you'll need to take the hit, both in the normal ending and the secret ending. Now that I just spoke about level 5's well-used opening segment, I'm going to speak about its antithesis. Level 5 starts off very linear, giving the player only one option in their first turn. Meanwhile, level 6 has a very open-ended beginning. From the get-go, it is a puzzle for the player to get out of this section at the top of the level. The beginning is so important in this level. Getting to Azazel completely depends on how you choose to interact with these 3 blocks. It isn't long before the player realizes pushing the middle block down is useless. But then that leaves the question, right block or left block? The amount of choices you give the player to make as they go through the level can correlate to the level's difficulty. The more options a player has, the more choices they'll have to consider, and we really see the idea in droves throughout Helltaker. Also worth of note is that right at the halfway point in the game, players are given an extra bit of incentive to get to the end of this level. From the overworld sprite, it's pretty clear Azazel looks nothing like the demons we've been encountering throughout the game. Being an angel, she looks quite out of place in Hell, and it was a great idea to include her at the halfway point. Her inclusion just adds more incentive to beat the level and see what her deal is. Level 7 features a lot of the elements of previous levels that I discussed. The player is given more options at the beginning of this level than ever before. Do they mess with these blocks, kick these skeletons, or go through this corridor of death? It's not clear what you're supposed to do first. Speaking of the corridor of death, it's what I would consider a very indulgently fun part of the level design. A clear win condition of this level is to get through this part on the right timing, avoiding all the spike tiles with careful planning. It's exciting to get through this part of the level without a single hit. It's that bit of excitement that I'm sure Van Ripper felt as soon as he thought to include this design in the level. Simply put, getting through this unscathed is fun, even if the fate of your run hinges entirely on your timing right here. The last bit I have to say about this level is how awesome Justice is. She has an amazing bit of characterization through gameplay, that both of her dialogue options yield success, and it contrasts well with how the next level handles its dialogue options. Speaking of the next level, level 8 is one of my favorite designs. That may seem crazy considering it's a pretty straightforward stage, but I'll explain my reasoning. First, as we've established, this game makes kicking skeletons very fun. So when you give a player a line of these guys, there's no way they don't just kick right through everybody. But doing so establishes a lesson to the player they could have understood since level 3. Kicking a skeleton and moving to its spot takes 2 turns, and isn't as efficient as avoiding them when possible. With how simplistic this level is, the only other option is to cut the line, which is just a hilarious subversion of player expectation. But the players that got tricked by this still got the rush of kicking all those skeletons into pieces. So, this level gives the best of both worlds. It both gives the player a fun skeleton kicking experience, before really driving home the focus on will points, and the path to victory is still engaging. It's pretty clever that the last level had no fail conditions in its end of level conversation, since this features too. But considering this level's short and very easy puzzle, once you get to the end, failure only puts you back a few mere seconds. The little animation that plays before the conversation starts is also cool. None of the other Demon Girls had an animation like this so far. If every character had animation in their cutscenes, the scope of the game would have been increased, so I really appreciate the decision to animate this scene specifically. It adds to the suspense of conversing with this game's version of Lucifer. Level 9 is a no-nonsense hard level, easily the hardest level in the game. The player will have to use everything they've learned so far to get the key and reach the end with enough will points. What makes this level so difficult is the amount of push blocks players have to keep in mind. The solution is very specific, so moving just one block wrong will tarnish the entire run. In terms of Helltaker's base game, I believe this level is just a bit of a difficulty spike, partially to extend the game's length. I could see some taking issues with this, but I really don't mind it. There's no secret mechanics here that aren't explained to the player. It really is a level built on trial and error. Which, yeah, all other levels are built like this too, but no other level has as many possible ways to lose as this one. This level really pushes the player, and as the life advice reminds the player, if they get stuck on this, it's okay to skip the puzzle if they find it too hard or just want to continue on with the story. I really appreciate this option it gives players. If you're here just for the gameplay or just for the comedic story, the game is willing to cater to your personal interests. This level does use some unnecessary push blocks to exaggerate its complexity. With the way the puzzle is set up, no player will ever be likely to hit these 6 blocks for really any reason. These 4 blocks can't even possibly be moved. This level solution comes when the player understands their 2 priorities, getting the key while leaving a clear path to the door. Once those are both figured out, we reach Helltaker's final level. This boss fight is clearly Helltaker's most distinct level. This is the only level in the base game that requires the player to react to the stage in real time, instead of being able to plan out their movements at their own pace. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about this departure from the other levels in the game. I can understand being against the change in gameplay style, but I've come to appreciate the evolution of its design strategies through its 4 phases, as well as the way it introduces the mechanics of its fight, which is paced pretty well. The first phase is tame. It gives the player a second to experience needing to move down at all times to avoid the spikes, before introducing the chains that Judgment attacks with. These are telegraphed with a flicker, giving the player a chance to avoid them if they come in contact with them. I really appreciate the first couple attack patterns that introduce this mechanic. If the player wants to avoid the chains completely, they can. They just need to go all the way to the right before going all the way to the left. Once that is done, they start attacking in more random patterns, and the player is introduced to how they proceed to the next phase of the boss, without any distractions or attacks. These chains manifest on the side for them to take a kick at. The health bar appears at the top and helps you visualize how many kicks each chain will take. Eliminate them both to move on to the next phase. On to phase 2, and things have already ramped up a bit. Now chains can appear horizontally as well, but please take note of how we don't get vertical and horizontal chains at the same time just yet. This is reserved for the next stage of difficulty. The chain locations have changed as well. Now they're as opposite from each other as they can be. This is because this phase of the fight is no longer safe, and you'll have to avoid the flickering chains as you're trying to deplete the boss's health. Phase 3 starts off the same as Phase 2, but it's not long before the vertical and horizontal chains start appearing together. This carries over into the chain kicking portion as well, although there's a very distinct pattern here. The flickering chains alternate between 2 and 3 chains, even giving the player a bit more difficulty in this section, is reined in a little bit with the consistent pattern. The last phase is the hardest chain patterns, as could be expected. but it's quite noticeable comparing the Phase 3 section of this to the Phase 4 section, which is more complicated. There's also the fact Phase 4 has 4 chains instead of 2, meaning the player will have to stay alive double as long. Once you finish Phase 4, it's time to finish the conversation with Judgment and beat the game. I also really love the fact that, like Justice, this conversation is a guaranteed win. Redoing a puzzle you've already solved because you answered a sim question wrong is much more easy to accept than needing to replay a difficult reaction-based section. I should also mention the way these flickering chains attacks get reused in the puzzle-based levels in Helltaker's DLC is really cool to me. It's really cool to see this mechanic expanded on in the original puzzle environment that the game began with. And now that the Helltaker has rounded up his horde of demon girls, the final level is all about making pancakes. Perhaps the ending I expected the least, and this is what I'd refer to as a reward level. Reward levels aren't hard, but they play to the strengths of the game's design pillars. Design pillars act as the main foundation for your game mechanics. I define Helltaker's 2 design pillars as challenging puzzles and comedic yet charming storytelling. This level plays upon both of those in different ways. First, the player gets to chat with every demon girl and see how they've changed or what they're up to since leaving Hell. Helltaker's appeal leans very heavily on its cast, and that can be seen how this last level is all about the characters. It's a chill, falling action sort of level that does a great job acting as the game's send-off. Now, remember when I said this game plays to both of Helltaker's design pillars? At first glance, it really only focuses on dialogue, but what is hidden in plain sight is arguably Helltaker's most challenging puzzle yet. Well, challenging if you don't resort to Google. If the player collects the 3 ancient slabs hidden among level 4, 5, and 6, they can access the secret ending. If I had to nitpick the game, I almost wish this was a secret level of its own that the player had to complete to meet the secret demon girl, but it does work as is. The fact that this secret ending is included means players may need to go back to at least 1 of 3 levels to solve them in a different way. I appreciate how this adds more content without bloating the level count. 10 excellently made levels, all fulfilling multiple purposes, is nothing to scoff at. That said, Helltaker did receive a free update on its first anniversary that added 7 more levels, with a whole new theme, aesthetic, and a new demon, Lore Master. I wanted to include some quick thoughts on it before wrapping up this video. I think the DLC is more challenging than the base game, especially with this boss fight. It's a little less comedic and more story focused, dropping hints about the thinly veiled mystery of who this Lore Master demon is, but my overall opinion is that it's a completely worthwhile addition to Helltaker. If you checked out the base game but you didn't check out the DLC, please do so. I really love the level design in here as well. I may cover it in a future video if there's interest. With that said, I've now given all my thoughts on Helltaker's level design, and a fair amount of its general game design. To summarize my final thoughts, I'm going to take a look at the art book the player unlocks for completing the game. This art book is a fantastic look into the decisions Helltaker's developer made when creating this cast of characters. While not exactly level design focused, just seeing how he goes about creating certain aspects of characters or cutting others is very interesting. This part about creating a template character to build the rest of your cast around, uniting them by common demon features, is great. The whole art book is full of notes that peel the curtain back a bit behind how Van Ripper approached the game, such as how Lucifer's place in Helltaker is about taking the player's guard down before the true final boss. When playing any game, it's very easy to forget just how much thought goes behind every character or level that's included. Sometimes features that devs aren't sure about get into the final build, sometimes because they aren't sure if their feature is actually good or if they're just being too hard on themselves. Van Ripper even displays a bit of hesitance with his choices in this art book, with Zdrada's design. I can't say enough of how much I appreciate the scope and pacing of the experience Van Ripper delivered. Helltaker, besides featuring so many examples of what makes a good level, is simply a great showcase of what a few talented developers can accomplish. I'm personally very excited for whatever Van Ripper makes next. Thanks for watching this analysis. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing, commenting, or leaving a like. I'm told that kind of stuff helps grow the channel. But besides all that, I wish you the best. Later!